The empire that had ruled the known world for centuries was bleeding from 1,000 wounds when the child who would remake it drew his first breath. Rome, in the 3rd century, after Christ, resembled nothing so much as a great beast, brought low by hunters too numerous to count, its strength ebbing with each passing season, while vultures gathered at the edges of vision, patient and watchful. Legions that had once marched in disciplined columns from Britain to Babylon now turned their swords against one another with terrifying regularity. Between the assassination of Severus Alexander in AD 235 and the rise of Diocletian 50 years later, more than 20 men claimed the purple, and most died violently for their ambition. Soldiers who should have guarded the frontiers, instead, made and unmade emperors according to their appetites, their loyalty purchased with donatives that emptied treasuries already strained beyond endurance. Maximinus Thrax set the pattern that his successors would follow to their graves. A Thracian giant who had risen through the ranks on the strength of his sword arm alone, he demonstrated that imperial power now belonged to whoever commanded the sharpest blades and the loosest purse strings. His murder by his own troops established a precedent that would repeat itself with numbing regularity. The very soldiers who elevated a man to supreme authority felt equally entitled to cut him down when his generosity faltered or his luck turned sour. The frontiers crumbled while Romans slaughtered Romans in endless civil strife. Germanic tribes sensed weakness as wolves scent wounded prey, their raiding parties growing bolder with each passing year. Where once a single legion could hold 100 miles of border, now entire armies struggled to contain enemies who had learned through bitter experience exactly how far Roman power had fallen. The Rhine and Danube, those ancient boundaries that Augustus had established as the limits of civilized dominion, became highways for invasion rather than barriers against barbarism. From the east came threats more organized and more terrible than any Germanic warband. The Sasanian Persians had overthrown the ancient Parthian dynasty and created an empire that remembered the glories of Cyrus and Darius, rulers who had humbled Greek cities and threatened Mediterranean civilization itself. These new masters of Mesopotamia looked upon Rome's distress with the calculating eyes of men who recognized opportunity when Providence placed it before them. Shapur the Great led his armies westward with ambitions that matched his tremendous abilities. Roman Syria trembled before Persian cavalry, whose armored riders seemed invincible against legions weakened by decades of civil war and neglected training. The catastrophe that followed would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. Emperor Valerian himself, ruler of the Roman world, fell into Persian hands after the Battle of Edessa in AD 260, the first Roman emperor ever captured by a foreign enemy. Persian sculptors carved the scene into living rock at Naqshi Rostam, where it remains visible to this day. Shapur on horseback, magnificent in victory, while Valerian kneels in supplication before him. The captured emperor spent his remaining years in Persian captivity, his fate a subject of dark rumor throughout the Roman world. Some said he served as a human footstool when Shapur mounted his horse. Others claimed his skin was stuffed and displayed in a Persian temple after death. Whatever the truth, his capture announced to all who had ears to hear that Rome's invincibility had become a memory rather than a fact. Currency that had once represented the wealth of nations became nearly worthless as desperate emperors debased the silver content to pay armies whose loyalty required constant reinforcement. Coins that Augustus had minted from nearly pure silver now contained barely 5% precious metal beneath their thin silver wash. Merchants who accepted payment in imperial currency found themselves holding tokens worth a fraction of their face value, while prices rose with dizzying speed as confidence in Roman money collapsed entirely. Trade networks that had bound the Mediterranean world together for centuries began to fray and snap under the combined pressures of invasion, civil war, and monetary chaos. Merchants who had once moved goods freely from Alexandria to Londinium now calculated whether the profits of commerce outweighed the risks of brigandage, piracy, and the simple uncertainty of knowing whether the government that guaranteed their contracts would survive the season. Many concluded that the dangers exceeded the rewards, and trade routes that had flourished for generations fell into disuse. Cities that had grown prosperous under the Pax Romana contracted behind hastily constructed walls, their populations shrinking as residents fled to the countryside or simply died without replacement. The Great Plague that struck during the reign of Marcus Aurelius returned with renewed fury, sweeping through communities already weakened by malnutrition and despair. Entire regions that had supported thriving populations became depopulated wastelands where wolves hunted in the ruins of abandoned villas. Agriculture suffered as the men who should have worked the fields marched instead in armies that promised plunder or conscripted labor that offered neither choice nor compensation. Lands that had fed cities went fallow, while granaries stood empty, creating famines that compounded the miseries already inflicted by war and disease. The Roman world, which had known unprecedented prosperity under the early emperors, began to forget what abundance felt like. Yet even in this age of iron and blood, forces stirred that would shape the world Constantine would inherit and transform. The old gods of Rome still received their sacrifices in temples that crowned every major city, their priests performing rituals that had remained essentially unchanged since the days of the Republic. Jupiter watched from his Capitoline throne, while Mars blessed the legions and Vesta guarded the sacred flame that symbolized Rome's eternal destiny. Mystery cults from the eastern provinces offered what traditional Roman religion could not: personal salvation, emotional connection with the divine, and the promise of blessed afterlife for initiates who underwent their sacred rites. Mithras gathered devoted followers among the soldiers who served on distant frontiers, his underground temples providing fellowship and meaning to men far from home. Isis welcomed worshippers regardless of social status, her maternal compassion appealing to those whom traditional religion had neglected or ignored. Among these competing faiths, Christianity continued its remarkable growth despite, or perhaps because of, periodic persecution. The followers of Christ had spread from their origins in Palestine to every corner of the Roman world, their communities bound together by shared beliefs, mutual support, and the conviction that they served the one true God whose kingdom would outlast all earthly empires. Their refusal to sacrifice to the traditional gods or acknowledge the emperor's divinity marked them as dangerous to authorities, who saw religious conformity as essential to political stability. Decius launched the first empire-wide persecution in AD 250, requiring all citizens to sacrifice to the gods and obtain certificates proving their compliance. Those who refused faced imprisonment, torture, and death, while those who complied under pressure faced ostracism from Christian communities that demanded absolute loyalty. The persecution revealed both the strength and the weakness of the Christian movement. Many apostatized under pressure, but many others embraced martyrdom with a courage that impressed even their executioners. Aurelian briefly restored Roman confidence through military victories that pushed back the frontiers and reunited an empire that had fractured into competing regional powers. The Gallic Empire in the west and the Palmyrene Empire in the east both fell before his legions. Their brief independence ended by a ruler who earned the title Restorer of the World. His construction of new walls around Rome itself, walls that had not been needed for centuries, spoke eloquently of how much the world had changed since the confident days of Augustus and Trajan. The reforms that might have stabilized the empire died with Aurelian when he fell to conspirators in AD 275, leaving his successors to struggle with problems he had only begun to address. The military required reorganization to meet threats that differed fundamentally from those the legions had been designed to counter. The economy needed sound currency and reliable tax collection to fund the armies that guarded the frontiers. The administration demanded rationalization to govern an empire too large and too complex for the institutions inherited from the Republic. Diocletian would eventually provide answers to these questions, creating the system that Constantine would inherit and transform. But that story lay in the future when, in the year AD 272, a child was born in the Balkan town of Nisus to a junior army officer named Constantius and a woman of humble origins named Helena. The infant received the name Constantine, and the world that awaited him offered nothing but chaos, danger, and, for those with eyes to see, opportunity beyond imagining. The stage was set for a drama that would reshape human history. An empire in crisis, an army that made and murdered its rulers, frontiers crumbling before enemies who smelled weakness on every wind, and a new faith growing in the shadows, waiting for the moment when its hour would come. Into this world of blood and fire, Constantine had been born, and nothing would ever be the same again. Nessus lay in the Balkan heartland, where mountains gave way to river valleys that had witnessed armies marching since before memory began. Here, in a garrison town that served as crossroads between east and west, the infant Constantine opened his eyes to a world of soldiers, horses, and the endless preparations for war that defined life along the Danube frontier. His father, Constantius, served as a military officer of rising promise. His mother, Helena, a woman whose origins later chroniclers would attempt to obscure or elevate according to their purposes. Helena's background remained a subject of delicate silence in the years of her son's glory. Some sources called her a stabularia, a stable maid or innkeeper's daughter, while others granted her more respectable ancestry. The truth mattered less than what her story revealed about the age itself. In the chaos of the 3rd century, a man of ambition could rise through military talent alone, and the women who shared their lives need not come from senatorial families. Constantius had taken Helena as wife or concubine, the distinction blurred in frontier provinces, and she had given him a son who would exceed every dream a junior officer might harbor. The child grew in the shadow of transformation, as Diocletian reshaped the very foundations of Roman power. This stern Dalmatian soldier had clawed his way to the purple through the familiar path of military coup, but unlike his predecessors, he possessed the vision to recognize that one man could no longer govern an empire stretching from Scotland to Mesopotamia. The solution he devised would determine the course of Constantine's life and the fate of millions yet unborn. The Tetrarchy divided supreme power among 4 rulers, 2 senior Augusti and 2 junior Caesars, each responsible for defending and administering a quarter of the Roman world. Diocletian claimed the wealthy eastern provinces for himself, installing his headquarters at Nicomedia in Asia Minor rather than Rome itself. His fellow Augustus, Maximian, received the West, ruling from Milan, where he could respond quickly to threats along the Rhine and Danube. Beneath these 2 supreme rulers served the Caesars, junior emperors who would theoretically succeed to the senior positions upon their predecessors' retirement or death. Galerius, a brutal soldier whose hatred of Christians would become legendary, served as Caesar under Diocletian in the east, and Constantius, Constantine's own father, received appointment as Caesar under Maximian, his territory encompassing Gaul, Britain, and Spain. The elevation transformed young Constantine's prospects with dizzying speed. The son of a junior officer became heir to an heir, his bloodline suddenly precious to an empire that had murdered too many potential successors to waste another. But this new status carried dangers that balanced its privileges, for the Tetrarchy's architects understood that family loyalty posed the greatest threat to their carefully constructed system. Diocletian's solution was elegant in its cruelty. The sons and relatives of each tetrarch would reside at the courts of their father's colleagues, honored guests in theory, hostages in practice. Should any tetrarch rebel against the system or attempt to establish a dynasty independent of the College of Emperors, his loved ones would pay the price of his ambition. Constantine found himself dispatched to the eastern courts, separated from his father by the breadth of the empire. The young man who arrived at Diocletian's court in Nicomedia had received the education appropriate to his new station. Latin and Greek flowed from his tongue with equal facility, while rhetoric and philosophy had sharpened a mind that nature had already made formidable. He had grown tall and strong, his physical presence commanding attention in any gathering, his eyes revealing an intelligence that missed nothing and forgot less. Nicomedia dazzled visitors with the splendor that Diocletian had lavished upon his chosen capital. Marble palaces rose where fishing villages had stood within living memory, their columns and courtyards proclaiming that Rome's glory had not diminished, but merely moved eastward. The court that gathered in these magnificent halls included the finest minds and the most dangerous intriguers the empire could produce, each pursuing advantage through a maze of protocol and precedent that Diocletian had deliberately constructed to elevate imperial majesty above ordinary humanity. Constantine learned to navigate these treacherous waters with a survivor's instinct. He watched as courtiers rose and fell, according to the emperor's shifting favor, noting which qualities earned advancement and which missteps brought destruction. The elaborate ceremonies that surrounded Diocletian, the gem-encrusted robes, the requirement that visitors prostrate themselves before the imperial presence, the calculated inaccessibility that transformed a Dalmatian soldier into a living god, taught lessons about power that no tutor could have conveyed. Military service provided escape from the hothouse atmosphere of the palace. Constantine rode with Diocletian's armies against enemies along the Danube and in the eastern deserts, proving himself in battles where imperial blood offered no protection against Persian arrows or Germanic axes. His courage drew notice from commanders, who recognized genuine ability beneath the privileged birth, while his conduct earned respect from common soldiers who cared nothing for politics but everything for competence. The years of education continued under Galerius, when that grim Caesar assumed greater responsibility for the eastern provinces. Here, Constantine encountered a different kind of ruler, blunt where Diocletian was subtle, cruel where the senior Augustus was merely ruthless, and nursing a hatred for Christians that would soon explode into the most terrible persecution the faith had yet endured. The young hostage learned to mask his thoughts behind a face that revealed nothing, a skill that would serve him well in the decades ahead. During these years of gilded captivity, Constantine took a woman named Minervina as wife or concubine. The sources disagree about her status, as they disagreed about Helena's, but they agree that she bore him a son. The child received the name Crispus, and his birth around AD 305 gave Constantine something beyond ambition to fight for, a legacy to protect, a future to secure, a bloodline that might yet rule the world his father had helped to govern. The Great Persecution erupted in AD 303, transforming the empire into a hunting ground for Christians. Diocletian and Galerius issued edicts that commanded the destruction of churches, the burning of scriptures, and the imprisonment of clergy who refused to sacrifice to the traditional gods. Blood flowed in every province as believers faced the choice between apostasy and death, their courage or their weakness witnessed by millions who had not yet chosen which god they would serve. Constantine watched these horrors unfold from his position at court, his own religious convictions carefully concealed behind the mask of loyal service. Whatever he believed in these years, and later sources would claim he had secretly favored Christianity long before his public conversion, he knew that survival required discretion. The beast was feeding, and those who drew its attention rarely escaped its jaws. Events beyond Constantine's control began reshaping the political landscape as the Tetrarchy entered its final crisis. Diocletian, exhausted by decades of rule and weakened by mysterious illness, made the unprecedented decision to retire from power. On May 1st, AD 305, he formally abdicated at Nicomedia, requiring his reluctant colleague Maximian to do the same in the west. The two Caesars, Galerius and Constantius, stepped up to become Augusti, while new Caesars were appointed to serve beneath them. Constantine had expected elevation to Caesar as his father's heir and natural successor. Instead, Galerius manipulated the appointments to favor his own creatures, men whose loyalty ran to him rather than to the sons of the retiring emperors. The message was clear. The Tetrarchy would not become a hereditary system, and those who harbored dynastic ambitions would find themselves excluded from power, regardless of their qualifications or their blood. The young man's position had become untenable. Trapped at the court of an Augustus who viewed him as a threat to be eliminated rather than an asset to be cultivated, Constantine faced a future that promised nothing but continued captivity or convenient death. Galerius reportedly threw him into dangerous situations, hoping that enemy weapons would accomplish what assassination might make too obvious. But Constantine survived each trial, his legend growing with every escape from death that should have claimed him. Word reached the Eastern Court that Constantius lay ill in Britain, his health failing as he campaigned against the Picts beyond Hadrian's Wall. The Augustus of the West had repeatedly requested his son's return, his messages growing more urgent as his condition worsened. Galerius delayed and deflected each appeal, understanding that Constantine's presence beside his dying father would create precisely the dynastic succession he was determined to prevent. The night that followed would become legend, embellished by later admirers, until separating fact from fiction became impossible. Constantine obtained permission to depart. Some said Galerius granted it in a moment of drunken carelessness. Others that Constantine simply left without waiting for approval that would never come. What happened next bore the marks of careful planning rather than impulsive flight. Racing westward through the night on the finest horse imperial stables could provide, Constantine stopped at each posting station along the Cursus Publicus, the imperial road network that allowed official messengers to travel with extraordinary speed by changing mounts at regular intervals. At each station, he took the best available horse and ordered the rest hamstrung or scattered, ensuring that no pursuit could match his pace. Behind him, he left chaos. Before him lay an empire waiting to be claimed. The journey covered over 1,000 miles through territories where Galerius's agents might have intercepted him at any point. Speed alone saved him. The desperate gallop of a man who understood that hesitation meant death, that every hour of delay increased the chances that his father would die before he arrived, that the future he had dreamed of since childhood hung upon the endurance of horses and the strength of his own will. Constantius still lived when his son reached him at Eboracum. the fortress city that Romans called York, in the summer of AD 306. The reunion between father and son moved witnesses who recorded it for posterity, though the Augustus had little time remaining for sentiment. Together, they campaigned against the Picts one final time. The dying emperor determined to secure Britain's northern frontier before passing authority to the son who had risked everything to reach his side. On July 25th, AD 306, Constantius breathed his last at York. The soldiers who had loved him turned immediately to his son, their acclamation thundering through halls that had witnessed the deaths of other emperors. They raised Constantine upon a shield in the ancient Germanic fashion, proclaiming him Augustus of the West in defiance of the tetrarchic system that should have determined succession through appointment rather than hereditary right. Constantine, barely 30 years old, had seized a quarter of the Roman world. Behind him lay years of captivity and careful observation. Before him stretched decades of warfare that would determine whether his gamble succeeded or ended in the same violent death that had claimed so many imperial aspirants. The soldiers who cheered his name that summer day in Britain could not know that they had elevated a man who would transform not merely the empire, but the faith of billions yet unborn. A new chapter had begun in a story that would reshape human history. The fugitive who had fled eastward through the night now commanded legions that stretched from Hadrian's Wall to the Pillars of Hercules. The game of empires was his to play, but 4 other men also held pieces on the board, and none of them intended to let Constantine survive long enough to claim the victory that his father's soldiers had declared. 6 emperors now claimed authority over portions of the Roman world, their competing ambitions guaranteeing that blood would flow until only the strongest remained. Constantine held Britain, Gaul, and Spain through his soldiers' acclamation, but legitimacy required more than military enthusiasm. Galerius grudgingly acknowledged him as Caesar, the junior rank that Constantine's father had once held, while reserving the title of Augustus for men whose elevation he had personally controlled. The tetrarchic system that Diocletian had designed to prevent civil war instead multiplied the contenders for supreme power. Maxentius, son of the retired emperor Maximian, seized Rome itself in October 306. His coup, supported by Praetorian guardsmen who resented Galerius's plans to disband their privileged unit. Italy and Africa fell under his control, their wealth and grain supplies making him a rival that none could ignore. Maximian himself emerged from retirement to support his son's usurpation, the old warrior unable to resist the pull of power he had supposedly abandoned. Father and son ruled jointly from Rome, their alliance creating a Western bloc that threatened both Constantine's territories and the legitimacy of emperors who had followed proper tetrarchic succession. The careful arrangements that Diocletian had constructed lay in ruins before the founder had been dead a year. Galerius attempted to restore order through military force, leading his legions against Maxentius in AD 307. The campaign ended in humiliating failure, as his army melted away before reaching Rome, soldiers deserting rather than fight against a ruler who controlled the treasury that paid their wages. The Augustus retreated eastward, his authority diminished and his system discredited by its inability to resolve disputes through any means other than the civil wars it had been designed to prevent. The Conference of Carnuntum in AD 308 represented a final attempt to salvage the tetrarchic principle. Diocletian himself emerged from his retirement palace at Split to preside over negotiations that reshuffled the imperial college yet again. Maximian was forced back into retirement, his brief return to power ending in public humiliation. Licinius, a military colleague of Galerius, received appointment as Augustus of the West, a title that ignored Constantine's claims entirely. and granted authority over territories that Maxentius actually controlled. Constantine responded to these deliberations with contemptuous disregard. He had not escaped Galerius's court and raced across the empire to accept whatever crumbs distant conferences chose to scatter. His soldiers had proclaimed him Augustus, and Augustus he would remain regardless of what elderly men decided in Pannonian meeting halls. The fiction of tetrarchic unity could no longer constrain ambitions that had outgrown its institutional framework. Marriage sealed the alliance that strategic calculation demanded. Constantine took Maximian's daughter Fausta as his wife, binding himself to the dynasty that controlled Rome, while positioning himself as potential heir to territories far beyond his current holdings. The ceremony took place at Trier, Constantine's capital in Gaul, with appropriate magnificence that proclaimed his status as a ruler who would treat with any power as an equal. The union required setting aside Minervina, whether through divorce or simply acknowledgement that their relationship had never constituted legal marriage. She disappeared from the historical record as completely as if she had never existed, her fate unknown, her son Crispus remaining with his father, as heir to whatever empire Constantine might carve from the chaos. Fausta brought legitimacy, political alliance, and eventually children who would carry forward the dynasty that Constantine was determined to establish. Maximian proved unable to accept the subordinate role that retirement imposed upon him. Twice he attempted to reclaim imperial authority, first by declaring his son Maxentius deposed, then by turning against his son-in-law Constantine when the first scheme collapsed. The old emperor's final plot unraveled when he attempted to seize Constantine's purple robes while the younger man slept, only to discover that Constantine had anticipated treachery and left a eunuch in the imperial bed. Captured and condemned, Maximian received permission to choose his own death, a privilege granted to high-ranking Romans since the days of the Republic. He hanged himself at Marseille in AD 310, his suicide ending a career that had spanned decades of service to Rome and years of desperate scheming to reclaim lost glory. Constantine buried his father-in-law with appropriate honors, while privately celebrating the removal of a threat that had complicated his position since the day of their alliance. The path to Rome now lay open before Constantine, blocked only by Maxentius and the legions that defended Italy. Constantine spent the years following Maximian's death consolidating his position in Gaul and along the Rhine, defeating Germanic tribes whose raids threatened his territories, while building the military strength that would carry him southward when the moment arrived. His army grew seasoned through constant campaigning, its loyalty secured through victories that filled soldiers' purses and elevated their commander's reputation. Religious transformation accompanied military preparation during these crucial years. Constantine began favoring the Christian God, whose power he had witnessed during the persecutions, though he maintained the traditional ceremonies that Roman religion required of emperors. His mother, Helena, had embraced Christianity with passionate devotion, her influence perhaps shaping her son's gradual movement toward the faith that had survived every attempt to destroy it. The campaign against Maxentius began in the spring of AD 312, Constantine leading perhaps 40,000 men across the Alps, through passes that Hannibal had used 5 centuries earlier. His army was smaller than the forces Maxentius could muster from Italy and Africa, but Constantine trusted in the quality of his Gallic veterans and the divine favor he believed accompanied his enterprise. Behind him, he left Gaul defended by skeleton garrisons, gambling everything on a single throw of the dice. Turin fell first, its garrison overwhelmed by cavalry charges that demonstrated Constantine's tactical flexibility. The city's capture opened the Po Valley to his advance, while denying Maxentius the forward defense that might have stopped the invasion before it gained momentum. Italian cities that had expected to resist found their walls unmanned. As Constantine's reputation preceded his army, local leaders calculating that surrender offered better prospects than futile resistance. Verona demanded a longer siege, its strong defences and loyal garrison refusing the quick capitulation that had delivered Turin. Constantine settled into the patient work of siege warfare, his engineers constructing the machines and earthworks that would eventually breach walls designed to withstand exactly such assaults. When Maxentius's relief force approached, Constantine divided his army with audacious confidence, leaving sufficient troops to maintain the siege, while personally leading his cavalry to intercept the reinforcements. The battle that followed shattered Maxentius's last hope of stopping Constantine north of Rome. The relief force broke under the impact of Gallic horsemen, whose charges had been perfected against Germanic warriors along the Rhine. Survivors fled southward, carrying news of defeat that multiplied with each telling, their panic spreading through an Italy that increasingly saw Constantine's victory as inevitable. Rome itself now awaited the conqueror, and with Rome came the confrontation that would determine whether Constantine lived as emperor or died as another failed usurper. Maxentius had fortified the city against siege, stockpiling supplies and strengthening walls that had protected Rome for generations. His strategy assumed that Constantine's army would exhaust itself against these defenses, while loyal forces gathered for the counterattack that would destroy the invader. The night before the final battle brought the vision that would transform Constantine's life and reshape human history. Sources disagree about the details. Some place the experience during the march through Gaul, others on the eve of combat outside Rome, but all agree that Constantine received divine communication that convinced him to fight under Christian symbols. Whether he saw a cross blazing in the afternoon sky, dreamed of Christ commanding him to mark his soldiers' shields, or experienced some combination of vision and dream, he awoke convinced that the God of the Christians had chosen him as instrument of divine purpose. Constantine ordered his soldiers to paint the Chi symbol on their shields, the first two Greek letters of Christ's name, overlapped to create a monogram that would become the most recognizable emblem of Christian imperial power. The army that had marched from Gaul under traditional Roman standards now advanced toward Rome, bearing marks that proclaimed allegiance to a deity whose followers had faced persecution within living memory. Maxentius made the decision that would seal his fate and deliver Rome to his rival. Rather than endure siege behind walls that Constantine might never breach, he led his army out to battle on the open ground north of the city. Perhaps he trusted oracles that promised victory. Perhaps he feared that prolonged siege would erode the loyalty of troops already shaken by news of disasters in the north. Whatever his reasoning, he chose battle, and the choice destroyed him. The Milvian Bridge carried the Via Flaminia across the Tiber, the ancient stone span providing the route by which Maxentius's army would engage Constantine's advancing forces. Alongside the permanent bridge, engineers had constructed a pontoon crossing to facilitate troop movements, its wooden boats lashed together to support the weight of armored soldiers and cavalry horses. The battle began on October 28th, AD 312, Constantine's veterans crashing into Maxentius's larger army with the confidence of men who believed God himself fought alongside them. The fighting was desperate and bloody, Roman killing Roman in the eternal struggle for supremacy that had drenched Italian soil with citizen blood since the days of Marius and Sulla. Gradually, Constantine's Gallic cavalry gained the advantage, their charges pushing Maxentius's forces back toward the river crossings. Retreat became rout as panic spread through Maxentius's ranks. Soldiers who had advanced confidently that morning now fled toward the bridges, Their only thought escape from the slaughter that Constantine's men inflicted on all who stood before them. The Tiber offered the only path to safety, but the bridges could not carry the weight of terrified thousands all pressing towards salvation at once. The pontoon bridge collapsed under the crush of desperate men, spilling soldiers into the October waters of the Tiber. Maxentius himself went into the river, his heavy armor dragging him beneath the surface while his army disintegrated around him. When his body was recovered the following day, Constantine ordered the head severed and mounted on a spear, the trophy carried before his army as it entered a Rome that had not seen a reigning emperor in years. The victory was complete, the transformation absolute. Constantine entered Rome as master of the Western Empire, his triumph celebrated with the ancient ceremonies that had honored conquering generals since the Republic. The Senate granted him the title of Senior Augustus, acknowledging what battlefield success had already demonstrated, that this son of Constantius now stood as the most powerful man in the Roman world. The Praetorian Guard, whose support had elevated Maxentius and whose privileges had motivated their defense of his regime, met the fate that Galerius had originally planned for them. Constantine disbanded the ancient unit entirely, scattering its soldiers to frontier garrisons where they could never again play kingmaker in the imperial city. The fortress that had housed these dangerous warriors was demolished, its stones repurposed for construction projects that would commemorate Constantine's victory, rather than remind Rome of those who had opposed him. The Arch of Constantine rose near the Colosseum, its massive form celebrating the triumph that had made its builder master of the West. The monument's inscriptions credited Constantine's victory to divine inspiration, its carefully ambiguous language allowing both Christians and traditionalists to interpret the reference according to their own beliefs. The arch stands to this day, its weathered stones testifying to the battle that began Christianity's transformation from persecuted sect to imperial religion. Constantine had conquered Rome, but half an empire remained in other hands. Licinius controlled the Balkans and contested the east with rivals whose claims were no stronger than his own. The final struggle for sole supremacy still lay ahead, but the man who had crossed the Milvian Bridge under the sign of Christ had already accomplished what none of his predecessors had managed. He had united military victory with religious transformation, creating a synthesis of power and faith that would define the next 1,000 years of European history. The road from York to Rome had been long and bloody, but Constantine had traveled it with a certainty that his enemies could never match. Whatever doubts he may have harbored in the privacy of his own heart, he presented to the world the face of a man chosen by God for purposes that transcended mere political ambition. That conviction would carry him through the struggles still to come, sustaining him through betrayals and tragedies that would have broken lesser spirits. Milan's Winter Palace witnessed a meeting that would reshape the religious landscape of the ancient world. Constantine, master of the West since the Milvian Bridge, received his fellow Augustus Licinius in February of AD 313. Their conference convened to settle the affairs of an empire still divided between competing rulers. The two men had much to discuss: boundaries, armies, the disposition of territories won and lost in the chaos of recent years. But the agreement that emerged from their deliberations would echo through centuries in ways neither could have fully anticipated. Licinius had risen through the same military ranks that had produced Constantine, his abilities proven in campaigns along the Danube, where Germanic raids tested Roman defenses with relentless persistence. Galerius had elevated him to Augustus in AD 308, granting authority over Balkan territories that placed him between Constantine's western domains and the rich provinces of the east. The arrangement had been calculated to create a counterweight against Constantine's growing power. But the death of Galerius in AD 311 had liberated Licinius to pursue his own ambitions without constraint. The Eastern Augustus Maximinus Dia presented a common threat that made alliance between Constantine and Licinius a matter of practical necessity. This nephew of Galerius had inherited both his uncle's territories and his hatred of Christians, persecuting believers with a ferocity that exceeded even the horrors of the Great Persecution. His armies threatened Licinius's eastern frontier, while his ambitions encompassed the entire Roman world. Against such a rival, former competitors found common cause. Marriage sealed the pact that strategic calculation had suggested. Constantine offered his half-sister, Constantia, to Licinius as bride, the union binding the two ruling houses through ties of blood that transcended mere diplomatic agreement. The ceremony took place at Milan with appropriate splendor, witnesses recording the magnificence that both emperors displayed as demonstration of their power and legitimacy. Constantia departed with her new husband to rule as Augusta over territories stretching from the Adriatic to the Black Sea. The agreement that historians would call the Edict of Milan emerged from these deliberations, though it took the form of letters dispatched to provincial governors rather than a single formal proclamation. Constantine and Licinius jointly declared that Christians throughout the empire would enjoy full freedom to practice their faith without interference from civil authorities. Churches that had been confiscated during the persecutions would be restored to their congregations, while believers who had suffered for their convictions would receive compensation for their losses. The language of the proclamation extended beyond Christianity to encompass all religions, granting every person the right to worship according to their own conscience. This universal toleration reflected both political prudence and genuine conviction. Constantine's growing commitment to Christianity required accommodation with colleagues and subjects who still honored the ancient gods, while the empire's diversity made religious uniformity an impossibility that only tyrants would attempt to enforce. Yet the edict's practical effects fell most heavily upon Christians, for they alone had faced systematic persecution under previous regimes. Temples to Jupiter and Mars continued their sacrifices as they had for centuries, their priests unaffected by proclamations that merely confirmed existing practice. Christians, by contrast, emerged from hiding into a transformed world where imperial favor had replaced official hostility, where the cross that had marked them for death now opened doors to advancement and influence. Churches rose from the ruins of persecution with astonishing speed. Congregations that had worshipped in private homes or underground chambers now constructed basilicas whose scale and magnificence proclaimed the faith's new status. Constantine himself funded many of these projects, his generosity providing the resources that transformed Christianity's physical presence in cities throughout the Western Empire. The Lateran Basilica in Rome, built on land that Constantine donated from imperial estates, established patterns that Christian architecture would follow for 1,000 years. Clergy received privileges that elevated them above ordinary citizens in the eyes of the law. Bishops gained the right to judge disputes among their congregations, their courts offering an alternative to secular justice that many preferred for its supposed impartiality and spiritual authority. Priests and deacons won exemption from the municipal obligations that burdened wealthy citizens, their service to God deemed more valuable than the civic duties that maintained roads, aqueducts, and public buildings. The Donatist controversy revealed the complexities that imperial patronage brought to a church accustomed to operating outside governmental structures. In North Africa, Christians had split over the question of how to treat believers who had surrendered sacred scriptures to persecutors rather than face martyrdom. The rigorist party, led by Donatus, refused to accept clergy who had compromised during the persecution, establishing parallel hierarchies that claimed to represent the true church untainted by apostasy. Constantine found himself drawn into this dispute when both factions appealed to imperial authority for resolution. The Western Augustus, who had conquered under the sign of Christ, now faced the uncomfortable discovery that Christians could not agree among themselves about who legitimately represented the faith he had embraced. His initial attempts at mediation through church councils failed to satisfy the Donatists, who rejected decisions that went against them and continued their schismatic practices despite imperial disapproval. The emperor's frustration mounted as the African dispute proved resistant to the solutions that worked in political conflicts. Bribes and threats, the tools that persuaded ambitious men to accept unwelcome arrangements, had little effect on believers convinced that eternal salvation depended upon maintaining doctrinal purity. Constantine eventually resorted to persecution of the Donatists, confiscating their churches and exiling their leaders. But even these measures failed to restore the unity he desired. The schism would outlast his reign by centuries, a permanent reminder that religious conviction operated by different rules than political calculation. Meanwhile, the alliance with Licinius accomplished its immediate purpose. Maximinus Dio launched his expected attack in early AD 313, crossing into Licinius's territory, while the Western Emperor was still returning from the Milan Conference. The campaign ended in disaster for the persecutor. Licinius crushed his army at the Battle of Ziralum, pursuing the defeated Augustus into Asia Minor, where disease or poison ended his life within months. The Christian communities he had tormented celebrated his death as divine judgment, while Licinius absorbed his territories to become master of the entire Eastern Empire. Two Augusti now ruled the Roman world between them, their alliance cemented by marriage and common interest, but containing seeds of conflict that patient observers could already discern. Constantine controlled the wealthier and more populous West, his territories stretching from Britain to Africa, his capital at Trier commanding the strategic crossroads where Rhine and Moselle converged. Licinius governed the ancient heartlands of Greek civilization, his domains encompassing the cities where philosophy and learning had flourished since before Rome's foundation. The boundary between their realms ran through the Balkans, that mountainous region where Latin and Greek cultures met and mingled. Here, ambiguities in their agreement created friction that diplomatic correspondence could not fully resolve. Border incidents multiplied as local commanders interpreted their instructions according to convenience rather than strict legality, while both emperors suspected the other of harboring designs against their territory. Constantine's growing family complicated the succession arrangements that any lasting settlement would require. Fausta had borne him sons, Constantine, Constantius, and Constans, whose futures their father was determined to secure. Crispus, the eldest son by Minervina, had grown into a young man whose abilities reminded observers of his father in younger years. These children represented Constantine's dynasty, the bloodline through which he hoped to perpetuate his achievements beyond his own lifetime. Licinius had his own son to consider, a child also named Licinius, whose mother was Constantine's sister Constantia. This nephew of the Western Augustus and heir to the Eastern throne created ties that should have bound the two imperial houses together. Instead, the boy became another point of tension, his existence reminding both emperors that their alliance would eventually give way to competition between their descendants. War came in AD 316, sparked by accusations of treachery that may have been genuine grievances or convenient pretexts. Constantine claimed that Licinius had sheltered a usurper who plotted against the Western throne, Licinius responded that Constantine had violated their territorial agreements by pursuing enemies into eastern provinces. The truth mattered less than the underlying reality. Two ambitious rulers sharing an empire would eventually find reasons to fight for sole supremacy. The Battle of Cibale, in October AD 316, demonstrated that Constantine's military genius had not diminished since the Milvian Bridge. His smaller army shattered Licinius's forces through the same combination of cavalry shock and infantry discipline that had destroyed Maxentius 4 years earlier. The Eastern Augustus fled the field as darkness fell, his army in ruins behind him, his confidence in military solutions badly shaken by the day's catastrophe. Further fighting at Mardia produced another victory for Constantine, though the results were less decisive than Cibale had been. Licinius retained enough strength to make continued war costly, while Constantine faced the prospect of campaigns far from his power base against an enemy who knew the eastern territories intimately. Negotiation offered both rulers what continued fighting might deny: security for Licinius, territorial gains for Constantine, and peace that allowed both to consolidate their positions. The settlement that emerged stripped Licinius of his European territories, except for Thrace, pushing the boundary between the two empires eastward to Constantinople's future doorstep. Both emperors elevated their sons to the rank of Caesar, creating an imperial college that recognized dynastic succession while maintaining the fiction of collegiate rule. Constantine's son, Crispus, and infant Constantine II, joined Licinius's young son as junior emperors, whose futures depended upon the continued cooperation of their fathers. Peace returned to an empire exhausted by decades of civil war, but the rivalry between Constantine and Licinius had merely paused rather than concluded. The Western Augustus emerged from the conflict with enhanced territory and prestige, his reputation as the empire's greatest general confirmed by victories that added to his legend. Licinius survived with diminished domains and wounded pride, his future dependent upon avoiding the provocations that might bring Constantine's legions eastward once again. Constantine used the years of peace to strengthen his hold on territories old and new. His legislation continued favoring Christians while maintaining formal tolerance for traditional religion, the delicate balance reflecting both genuine conviction and political necessity. Churches multiplied under his patronage, their bishops becoming figures of importance, whose opinions the emperor sought on matters extending far beyond purely spiritual concerns. The transformation that had begun at the Milvian Bridge continued its inexorable progress. An empire that had persecuted Christians within living memory now showered them with privileges that attracted converts whose sincerity later generations would question. The cross that Constantine had seen in the sky, or dreamed, or imagined, had become the symbol of an imperial Christianity that would dominate European civilization for more than 1,000 years to come. But the peace that settled over the Roman world in AD 317 was merely an intermission in a drama that had not yet reached its climax. Licinius still ruled the East, his ambitions checked but not extinguished, his resentment smouldering beneath the courtesies that diplomatic necessity required. The final confrontation between the two Augusti lay in the future, waiting for the moment when one or the other would decide that shared empire had become intolerable. The uneasy peace between East and West endured for 7 years, each passing season adding new grievances to the catalogue of complaints that both emperors maintained against the other. Constantine consolidated his hold on territories stretching from the Atlantic to the Balkans, his administration bringing order to provinces that had known little but chaos for generations. Licinius brooded in his eastern domains, watching his rival's power grow while his own remained static, the humiliation of Cibale festering in memory like an unhealed wound. Religious policy became the wedge that split the imperial partnership beyond repair. Constantine's favor toward Christians had only deepened since the Milvian Bridge, his legislation increasingly reflecting the values of a faith he had publicly embraced. Bishops attended his court as honored advisors, their influence extending into matters of state that previous emperors would never have shared with religious figures. The cross appeared on imperial standards and coinage, proclaiming to all the empire that its master served the Christian God. Licinius moved in the opposite direction, his tolerance for Christianity cooling into suspicion and eventually hardening into persecution. Perhaps he genuinely believed that Christian loyalty to Constantine made believers a fifth column within his territories. Perhaps he calculated that attacking the faith his rival championed would differentiate his rule and attract support from traditionalists who resented the changes Constantine had imposed. Whatever his reasoning, he began restricting Christian worship with measures that recalled the great persecution his predecessor Galerius had launched. Churches in eastern provinces found themselves forbidden to hold councils, their bishops prevented from gathering to discuss matters of doctrine and discipline. Women were prohibited from attending services alongside men, a regulation designed to disrupt the communal worship that bound Christian communities together. Clergy faced demands that they sacrifice to the traditional gods or surrender their positions, the old choice between apostasy and suffering, returning to haunt believers who had thought persecution ended forever. Constantine watched these developments with a mixture of genuine religious outrage and calculated political advantage. Each restriction Licinius imposed provided fresh justification for intervention. Each martyrdom, another argument that the Eastern Augustus had broken faith with the agreements that bound them. The Western emperor began styling himself as protector of Christians everywhere, his propaganda presenting the coming conflict not as a war of territorial ambition, but as a crusade to liberate the faithful from tyrannical oppression. The immediate cause of war came from the Gothic frontier, where barbarian raids had penetrated deep into Roman territory. Constantine led his forces against the invaders, pursuing them across boundaries that the peace settlement had established between the two imperial domains. Licinius protested this violation of his sovereignty, his ambassadors demanding explanations that Constantine dismissed with contempt. The diplomatic fiction that had maintained peace since AD 317 had finally exhausted its usefulness. Both emperors understood that the coming war would determine which of them survived to rule alone. Constantine assembled the largest army he had ever commanded, drawing legions from every frontier to create a force that ancient sources numbered at well over 100,000 men. His fleet gathered in the harbours of Greece and the Aegean, hundreds of vessels prepared to challenge Licinius's naval superiority in the waters that separated Europe from Asia. Crispus commanded the Western fleet, his father's confidence in the young Caesar reflecting abilities that had already been proven in campaigns along the Rhine. The eldest son had grown into everything Constantine could have wished. Brave in battle, wise in council, popular with soldiers who saw in him a worthy successor to the dynasty his father was building. At 19 years of age, Crispus bore responsibilities that would have crushed lesser men. His performance in the coming campaign destined to determine whether his reputation would match his father's legend. Licinius prepared to meet the invasion with forces that matched Constantine's numbers, if not his quality. The Eastern Augustus had spent years fortifying the approaches to his territory, understanding that geography favored defense against any attack from the west. The narrow straits separating Europe from Asia created choke points where superior numbers meant little, while his fleet controlled the waters that any invasion must cross to reach the wealthy provinces of Anatolia and Syria. The campaign began in the summer of AD 324, Constantine leading his army eastward through the Balkans toward the great city of Adrianople. Licinius had chosen this site for his stand, positioning his forces behind the Hebrus River, where the terrain favored the defensive battle he hoped to fight. The two armies that faced each other across the waters represented the accumulated military strength of the entire Roman world, their collision certain to produce slaughter on a scale not seen since the civil wars of the previous century. Constantine's tactical genius found solutions that his enemies could not anticipate. Rather than launch frontal assaults against prepared positions, he sent cavalry forces upstream to find crossing points that Licinius had left inadequately defended. The flanking movements that resulted threw the Eastern army into confusion, their defensive arrangements rendered meaningless by attacks that came from unexpected directions. The Battle of Adrianople on July 3rd, AD 324, ended in the rout of Licinius's army. Thousands of Eastern soldiers fell before the Western legions, their bodies choking the river that had failed to protect them. Licinius himself escaped the slaughter, fleeing toward the Bosphorus with the remnants of his forces, while Constantine's army pursued relentlessly. The Eastern Augustus had gambled everything on stopping the invasion in Thrace, and the gamble had failed catastrophically. Byzantium offered temporary refuge, its ancient walls providing the shelter that open battle had denied. Licinius gathered his surviving forces within the city while summoning reinforcements from the Asian provinces, his fleet still intact and capable of preventing any crossing of the straits. The strategic situation had shifted from land to sea. Constantine controlled Europe, but Licinius held Asia, and the narrow waters between them would determine which emperor emerged victorious. Crispus proved equal to the challenge his father had entrusted to him. Leading the Western fleet through the Hellespont against winds and currents that favored his enemies, the young Caesar demonstrated seamanship and tactical skill that exceeded anything his more experienced opponents had anticipated. The naval battle that followed destroyed Licinius's fleet as thoroughly as Adrianople had destroyed his army, its scattered remnants fleeing into the Black Sea, while burning hulks drifted on waters that had never witnessed such carnage. The victory at the Hellespont opened the passage to Asia, its strategic consequences extending far beyond the immediate military situation. Licinius could no longer prevent Constantine's forces from crossing to the eastern shore, his naval superiority eliminated by a commander whose youth had led his enemies to underestimate him. Crispus emerged from the campaign as a hero whose fame rivaled his father's, his future as Constantine's successor seemingly assured by achievements that all the empire had witnessed. Licinius abandoned Byzantium for the Asian shore, establishing his last position at Chrysopolis across the Bosphorus from the city he had failed to hold. Here he gathered every soldier he could summon, his army rebuilt through desperate levies that stripped eastern provinces of their defenders. The emperor who had once ruled from the Adriatic to the Euphrates now commanded little more than the ground his soldiers occupied, his authority evaporating as news of defeat spread through territories that sensed his imminent fall. Constantine crossed the Bosphorus with an army flushed with victory and confident in their commander's invincibility. The soldiers who had followed him from Britain to the gates of Asia believed that God himself fought alongside their emperor, the cross they carried blessed with divine power that no earthly force could withstand. Against such conviction, Licinius could oppose only the desperation of a man who understood that defeat meant death. The Battle of Chrysopolis on September 18th, AD 324, ended the last challenge to Constantine's supremacy. The Western army broke through Licinius's lines with the irresistible momentum that had characterized every engagement of the campaign. their victory complete before the sun reached its zenith. 25,000 Eastern soldiers died on the field, their blood consecrating the ground where Constantine's sole rule began. Licinius fled the carnage with a handful of followers. His reign effectively ended, though his body still breathed. Constantia interceded for her husband's life, the bonds of blood that connected her to both emperors, providing leverage that no other advocate could claim. She journeyed to her brother's camp, bearing pleas for mercy, her arguments combining sisterly affection with political calculation about the dangers of executing a man who had worn the purple. Constantine granted her request, accepting Licinius's surrender on condition that the defeated Augustus retire to private life in Thessalonica under comfortable but firm supervision. The promise of clemency lasted less than a year. In AD 325, Constantine ordered Licinius's execution on charges of treasonous conspiracy, the former emperor strangled by soldiers who had once saluted him as master of the world. Whether genuine plots justified this judicial murder, or merely provided convenient pretext for eliminating a potential rallying point for opposition, the sources do not clearly reveal. Licinius's young son, Constantine's own nephew through Constantia, followed his father to death shortly afterward. The boy's existence too dangerous to tolerate, even though he had never committed any offense beyond being born to a defeated rival. Constantine stood alone as master of the Roman world, the first sole Augustus since Diocletian had divided imperial power 4 decades earlier. From the mists of Britain to the sands of Egypt, from the forests of Germany to the mountains of Armenia, his word was law, his will supreme, his authority unchallenged by any earthly power. The fugitive who had fled Galerius's court under cover of darkness now commanded resources that exceeded anything the empire had concentrated in a single pair of hands. The transformation extended beyond mere territorial control to encompass the very nature of imperial rule. Constantine had conquered not merely through military excellence, though his generalship ranked among the finest the Roman world had ever produced, but through religious conviction that had sustained him through years of struggle. The god who had granted him victory at the Milvian Bridge had now delivered the entire empire into his hands, and Constantine intended to govern as that god's chosen instrument on earth. Military reorganization reflected the lessons that decades of civil war had taught. Constantine completed reforms that Diocletian had begun, creating mobile field armies, the comitatenses, that could respond rapidly to threats anywhere in the empire. These elite forces remained under direct imperial control, their loyalty secured through generous pay and the personal bond with their commander that Roman soldiers had always valued. Frontier garrisons, the limitanae, held the borders against routine raids, calling upon the field armies only when major invasions required concentrated response. The gold solidus that Constantine introduced brought stability to an economy that had suffered through generations of currency debasement. This new coin maintained its weight and purity throughout his reign and for centuries afterward, its reliability making it the preferred medium for international trade from Ireland to India. Merchants who had learned to distrust imperial currency discovered that Constantine's gold held its value, their renewed confidence contributing to economic recovery that benefited every province. Administrative reforms reorganized the empire into prefectures, dioceses, and provinces, creating hierarchies of authority that would persist in various forms for 1,000 years. The bureaucracy that managed this vast structure grew accordingly, its officials replacing the military commanders who had dominated government during the chaotic 3rd century. Civilian and military authority separated into distinct chains of command, reducing the risk that ambitious generals might follow Constantine's own path to supreme power. Sunday rest became law throughout the empire. Constantine's decree in AD 321, establishing the Christian Sabbath as a day when courts would not sit and most labor would cease. This legislation applied to all subjects, regardless of their religious beliefs, its practical effects transforming the rhythm of daily life for millions who had never heard of Christ. The 7-day week, with its day of rest, would become one of Constantine's most enduring legacies, surviving the fall of Rome itself to structure time in societies around the world. Yet even in the hour of his greatest triumph, shadows gathered that would darken Constantine's final years. The unity he had imposed through conquest concealed divisions that military victory could not heal. Christians who had celebrated his protection now discovered that their emperor expected obedience in matters of doctrine as well as politics. His interventions in theological disputes creating resentments that would fester for generations. The family that should have secured his dynasty harbored secrets whose revelation would shatter the image of Christian virtue that Constantine had so carefully constructed. The sole Augustus, who had united the Roman world under his rule, would soon discover that the greatest threats to his legacy came not from external enemies, but from within the walls of his own palace. The victories that had seemed to promise eternal glory would give way to tragedies that later generations would struggle to explain or excuse. Constantine had conquered an empire, but he had not yet confronted the darkest chapters of his own story. The church that Constantine had liberated from persecution now threatened to tear itself apart over questions that the emperor could barely comprehend. In Alexandria, a priest named Arius had begun teaching doctrines about the nature of Christ that horrified his bishop and delighted his followers in roughly equal measure. The controversy that erupted from his teachings would consume Constantine's attention during the very years when he should have been savoring the fruits of his final victory. Arius taught that the Son of God, while divine, was not eternal in the same way as the Father. There was a time, he argued, when the Son did not exist, a moment before creation when God the Father existed alone, before begetting the Word through whom all things were made. This teaching seemed logical to many who struggled to understand how Christianity could proclaim one God while worshipping Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as equally divine. To others, it represented a fundamental betrayal of the faith that martyrs had died to preserve. Alexander, Bishop of Alexandria, condemned Arius and expelled him from the church, but the condemned priest found refuge and support among bishops in other provinces who saw merit in his arguments. Letters flew between cities as churchmen debated questions that had occupied Christian thinkers since the apostolic age. The controversy spread like fire through dry timber, dividing congregations that had only recently emerged from persecution into factions whose mutual hostility exceeded anything they had shown toward pagan persecutors. Constantine watched this spectacle with growing alarm. The God who had granted him victory over all his enemies now seemed incapable of maintaining peace among his own worshippers. The emperor who had conquered Licinius to liberate Eastern Christians discovered that the Christians he had liberated could not agree about the most basic questions of their faith. His attempts to mediate through letters accomplished nothing. Both sides claiming his words supported their position while continuing their disputes with undiminished fury. The solution that emerged from Constantine's frustration was unprecedented in the history of Christianity. He would summon the bishops of the entire church to a council where they would settle their differences under his watchful eye, their decisions carrying the authority of imperial endorsement. The town of Nicaea in Asia Minor, close to the imperial residence at Nicomedia, would host this gathering. The emperor himself would preside, his presence guaranteeing that whatever the council decided would become the law of both church and state. More than 300 bishops assembled at Nicaea in the summer of AD 325, their journey funded by the imperial treasury, their accommodations provided at imperial expense. They came from every corner of the Christian world, from Spain and Gaul, from Africa and Egypt, from Syria and Mesopotamia, from territories that had never acknowledged Roman rule. Some bore the scars of persecution, their bodies marked by tortures they had endured rather than deny their faith. Others came from communities that had known Christianity for generations, their learning refined through centuries of theological reflection. Constantine entered the council chamber with the magnificence that befitted the master of the world, his robes gleaming with gold and precious stones, his presence commanding the attention of every eye. Yet the emperor, who could have imposed his will through military force, chose instead to present himself as a servant of the church, his opening address expressing hope that the bishops would find unity through their own deliberations rather than imperial command. The debates that followed revealed the depth of division that Arius's teaching had created. Supporters of the Alexandrian priest argued with passionate conviction that their understanding of Christ's nature preserved monotheism while acknowledging the Son's divine status. Opponents countered with equal passion that Arianism reduced Christ to a creature, however exalted, destroying the salvation that depended upon God himself entering human flesh to redeem humanity from sin and death. Constantine followed these arguments with the attention of a man whose eternal destiny might depend upon reaching the correct conclusion. His theological training was limited. He was a soldier and administrator, not a philosopher or priest, but he understood that the questions being debated touched the very heart of the faith he had embraced. The God who had appeared to him before the Milvian Bridge was either truly God or merely the highest of created beings, and the difference mattered more than any territorial dispute he had ever resolved through war. The council's solution took the form of a creed that would echo through centuries of Christian worship. The bishops declared that the Son was of one substance with the Father, homoousios in Greek, a term that excluded Arian interpretations, while affirming the full divinity that Orthodox Christians believed Scripture and tradition required. Arius and the few bishops who refused to accept this formula faced exile, their teachings condemned as heresy that no Christian could embrace without endangering their salvation. Constantine endorsed the council's decisions with the full weight of imperial authority, his signature transforming theological conclusions into enforceable law. The Nicene Creed became the standard of orthodoxy throughout the empire, its phrases memorized by millions who would recite them in churches for the next 17 centuries. The emperor, who had once watched Christians die for their faith, now determined what that faith would teach, his power extending from the battlefield to the altar. Yet even as Constantine celebrated this apparent triumph of Christian unity, tragedy struck at the heart of his family with devastating force. The year AD 326 brought horrors that no military victory could redeem, their shadow darkening the remainder of his reign and his reputation for all time. Crispus had returned from the Eastern campaign covered in glory, his naval victory at the Hellespont having contributed decisively to his father's triumph over Licinius. The young Caesar, who had proven himself worthy of the dynasty, now governed Gaul with a competence that reminded older observers of Constantine himself in younger years. His future seemed assured. He was his father's acknowledged heir, his abilities proven, his popularity among soldiers and civilians alike beyond question. What happened next remains shrouded in mystery that contemporary sources were either unable or unwilling to penetrate. In the summer of AD 326, Constantine ordered his eldest son arrested, tried on charges that no surviving source clearly specifies, and executed. Crispus died at Pola in Istria, his body denied proper burial, his name erased from inscriptions throughout the empire as if he had never existed. The heir who had seemed destined for greatness vanished from history so completely that later generations struggled to reconstruct even the basic facts of his life. Fausta followed her stepson to death within weeks, her end coming in the heated chambers of the imperial baths. Whether she was executed on Constantine's orders, took her own life in shame, or died in some manner that the sources deliberately obscured, the result was the same. The empress who had borne Constantine 3 sons and shared his bed for nearly 2 decades perished in circumstances that suggested guilt rather than innocence. Later, writers attempted to explain this double tragedy through stories of forbidden passion and murderous deception. Some claimed that Fausta had accused Crispus of attempting to seduce her, her false testimony convincing Constantine to execute his innocent son. When the emperor discovered the truth, perhaps through his mother Helena's intervention, he turned his wrath upon the lying wife who had destroyed his heir. Others suggested that the affair between stepson and stepmother was real, their adultery demanding the deaths that followed its discovery. The truth lies buried beyond any historian's ability to recover. Constantine never explained his actions publicly, and those who knew the facts had every reason to maintain silence. What remains certain is that the emperor who had unified the Roman world under Christian rule killed his own son and wife in the same season that he should have been celebrating his greatest achievements. The champion of a faith that preached forgiveness and mercy had demonstrated that he remained capable of the ruthless violence that had characterized Roman emperors since the days of Augustus. Helena departed for the Holy Land in the aftermath of these tragedies, her pilgrimage perhaps representing penance for sins her son had committed, or escape from a court polluted by family blood. The elderly empress, she was nearly 80 years old, undertook the arduous journey to Palestine with a determination that impressed all who witnessed it. Her mission combined genuine devotion with imperial resources that could accomplish what private pilgrims could never achieve. In Jerusalem, Helena supervised excavations at sites associated with Christ's passion and resurrection. Christian tradition would credit her with discovering the true cross itself, the wooden beams upon which Jesus had died, emerging from beneath the rubble of a pagan temple that Hadrian had constructed to obscure the sacred locations. Whether this discovery was historical fact or pious legend, it established patterns of relic veneration that would shape Christian devotion for 1,000 years. Churches rose at Helena's command on sites her investigations had identified. The Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem marked the cave where tradition placed Christ's birth. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem enshrined the locations of crucifixion and resurrection, its construction transforming a provincial city into the spiritual center of the Christian world. These buildings represented Constantine's wealth and Helena's devotion, working together to create monuments that would draw pilgrims from every corner of Christendom. Helena died around AD 330, her final years spent in works of charity and devotion that the Church would long remember. Constantine honored his mother with a magnificent funeral, and eventually with recognition as a saint whose feast day the Church would celebrate for centuries. Whatever her role in the tragedies of AD 326, and the sources suggest she may have prompted Constantine to investigate Fausta's accusations against Crispus. She ended her life surrounded by an aura of sanctity that obscured any darker associations. Meanwhile, Constantine had turned his attention to a project that would reshape the geography of power for 1,000 years. The ancient Greek colony of Byzantium, strategically positioned where Europe met Asia across the narrow waters of the Bosphorus, would become his new capital. Here he would build a city worthy of the Christian empire he had created, a new Rome that would eventually eclipse the original in wealth, power, and cultural influence. Construction began even before the final defeat of Licinius, Constantine's architects transforming a modest trading city into a metropolis that could house an imperial court and the institutions it required. Walls expanded to encompass territory that would accommodate populations larger than any ancient city except Rome itself. Forums, palaces, and public buildings rose with astonishing speed, their construction funded by treasures that victory over Licinius had delivered into Constantine's hands. Churches received prominent positions in the new city's plan, their presence proclaiming that this would be a Christian capital in ways that pagan Rome could never become. The temples and shrines that crowded the ancient capital had no counterparts in Constantinople. Instead, the cross-crowned buildings that celebrated the faith Constantine had championed since the Milvian Bridge, Hagia Irene and the first Hagia Sophia, established patterns of imperial church building that Constantine's successors would elaborate over the coming centuries. Yet Constantinople was not merely a Christian city, it was Constantine's city, its very name proclaiming whose vision had called it into being. The emperor filled his creation with treasures gathered from across the ancient world, statues and monuments that represented the accumulated artistic achievement of Greek and Roman civilization. The serpent column from Delphi, the bronze horses that had once adorned Chios, countless other masterpieces found new homes in a city that presented itself as heir to everything admirable in pagan antiquity, while pointing toward a Christian future. The dedication of Constantinople on May 11th, AD 330, marked the formal birth of a city that would endure for more than 1,000 years as capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. Ceremonies combined Christian liturgy with traditional Roman pageantry, the blend reflecting Constantine's own synthesis of old and new. The emperor who had conquered under the sign of the cross now presided over a city that would carry his name and his faith into ages he could not imagine. 7 years of supreme power had brought Constantine achievements that would have satisfied any emperor. Military victory, religious transformation, administrative reform, and now the creation of a new capital that would rival Rome itself. Yet the blood of his son and wife stained these accomplishments, their deaths a mystery that biographers would debate for centuries without resolution. The Christian emperor, who had outlawed gladiatorial combat and preached mercy, had proven capable of violence against his own family that pagans would have found excessive. The final years of Constantine's reign lay ahead, years that would see further attempts to resolve the religious controversies that Nicaea had failed to end, continued development of the city that bore his name, and eventually the approach of death itself. The emperor who had transformed the Roman world would face his own mortality, knowing that judgment awaited, and wondering, perhaps, whether the God he had served so faithfully would forgive the sins he had committed in the service of dynasty and power.